Hello, everyone. Today we will talk about, we have a new lecture, and we will talk about jazz music. So, a lot of interesting aspects will be discussed. Um, all right, so first of all, what is jazz? And why do we talk about jazz after we have covered 1900 years of, more than 1900 years of music, classical music? The reason is that jazz is considered to be an amalgamation of classical music and African American music. Actually, at the beginning was African music, and then it became African American music. So that's why we call it jazz, the American music, because it was the result of European music blended with elements of African music, African American music. For the purpose of this class, you should try to memorize this timeline here that I have included in the slides here, the second slides here, and so the earliest form of jazz: ragtime, blues, Dixieland, swing, bebop, and free jazz. Now, all these styles of jazz overlapped, so it's not like when ragtime ended, blues began. So there was a lot of historical, chronological overlapping. The first one of the first element of jazz, which is very important, is ragtime. I'm sure you've heard ragtime. Ragtime is characterized by syncopated rhythm. So syncopated, which is or ragged, as I underline here. So syncopated means when you place the accent of the music on the upbeat instead of the downbeat. Okay, so St. Louis and New Orleans were kind of the two places where this genre was cultivated, and I'm sure you heard about Scott Joplin and the famous Maple Leaf Rag, which is actually included in the last quiz. Even though you don't have to understand it through listening it, you do have to remember the title and the composer. So, but you should listen to it, so because it helps for you to understand the music, or at least remember the music. Blues is the other element that contributed to the diffusion of jazz, or one of the elements that constitutes jazz. The two characteristics which I want you to remember of blues for the purpose of this class is that there are 12 bar progressions, so there are 12 chords which repeat constantly, and then there is the use of the blues pentatonic scale. So the blues pentatonic scale is like a scale of 7 notes, right? And is used over and over again by blues musicians to improvise. So improvise means basically that the music is not written down, but is actually made on the spot. Okay, so these are the two elements: 12 bar progressions or 12 bar blues. One of the one of the most important figure in the history of blues, at least vocal blues, is Bessie Smith. And also one of her compositions is actually in the quiz as well, in the last quiz as well. She's considered the empress of the blues for different reasons, but she became famous at that time, and she was also very important for vocal techniques in general in blues, not just the history of blues. The other element is Dixieland. So Dixieland is another form of early jazz. And what's the difference between Dixieland, blues, and ragtime? So the difference is that basically Dixieland was performed by larger bands, not too big, but larger bands on the stage. So you had the front line, which is where you have the trumpet, the trombone, the clarinet, and then you have the rhythmic section where you have the guitar, the piano, and the drums. Okay, so percussion instruments. Dixieland developed in New Orleans, okay, and it's important because it's one of the earliest recorded style of jazz music. Okay, now recording is very important for music because, especially for jazz, because it allowed the diffusion of jazz songs and blues songs more easily, because when you have a radio and you have recording, then that's very important. And one of the fathers of Dixieland is this guy here. His name was Louis Armstrong, very, very, very famous musician. And I included as an example, you should listen to this piece, which is When the Saints Go Marching In. And again, I'm sure you heard these pieces. Maybe you didn't know that it's called Dixieland, but I'm sure you heard it before. And then you have another element to early jazz, which is swing. So swing, it's also a term that we use in jazz. It's kind of the way you play. Swing really also developed in New Orleans. And by the way, there was for a long time, scholars have thought that New Orleans was the only center for early jazz, but, we know now that there were other important cities where jazz emerged, even though New Orleans still is considered one of the most important, if not the most important, at least one of the most important centers. But what happened is that in the 20s and early 30s, a lot of clubs in New Orleans were closed down, so jazz musicians were left without jobs. So a lot of them went to Chicago. So Chicago really became the second Mecca for music, for jazz. So the second main center for music after New Orleans. And a lot of clubs opened up, and blues and jazz developed in Chicago, eventually in New York as well, especially with Duke Ellington and other musicians. And one of the most famous clubs in New York was the Cotton Club, right? And again, this is another example which will be in the quiz, in the last quiz. So I mentioned radio earlier. So the 1930 with the swing jazz, the other characteristic of swing jazz was performed by big bands. When I say big bands, I mean huge. So I mean it could be 30, 40 people on the stage performing. And that's another characteristic which differentiates swing jazz from the previous forms of jazz. Thanks to radio, also, that's why I said earlier that radio was very important, because swing jazz became very prominent in the U.S., especially because of the radio, okay? Which the radio, allowed people to listen to music everywhere, in the car, in the bars, and so on. The other idea behind jazz, which was a little later in the 1940s, was bebop. So bebop is a very interesting type of jazz because it was experimented by few African-American musicians in New York City, but it was very challenging from a technical point of view. So it was more sophisticated. It was a more intellectual form of jazz because they were experimenting with sounds, with rhythms, with harmonies, and it was very important. So the difference between bebop and swing and Dixieland is that bebop was not supposed to be danced to. It was not a kind of jazz was supposed to be performed in dance halls or was supposed to dance. It was a more sophisticated, okay? It was a more experimental form of jazz. And they experimented a lot with dissonances, so a lot of clashing sounds, chords, rhythmic ideas, and so on. And these are two of the most important, they're not the only ones, but the two most famous bebop musicians, who are Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And these are all examples here. You can listen to all of them. Unfortunately, if we were in class, physically, I was going to play them all, but I can't do that. But you have time to do that. So, Thelonious Monk, that's the other bebop musician. He was a pianist, okay? And he was a bebop, part of the bebop group. Then cool jazz. Cool jazz, again, it's a different type of jazz. It grew up in the 40s. It started in the 40s. And the difference between bebop and cool jazz is that it was more calm. It was more a smooth form of jazz. So it was not supposed to be frenetic, it was supposed to be challenging rhythmically, and in fact, it had very linear melodic lines, right? It was still sophisticated for that time, but it was not as it was different from bebop. The modal jazz was another type of jazz. It was based on modes. That's why it's called a modal, because modes were specific types of scales that jazz musicians used to improvise at that time. And then you have all kinds of jazz after that. So I would say that after the 40s, a lot of different experimentation, 50s too, began in jazz music. So you have free jazz. So you have jazz. Free jazz means basically where you have different types of music, of world music, and experiment, included in with jazz songs, or musicians experimenting with different sounds and different rhythms from world music. And then, of course, you had in the 50s, 60s, you have Latin jazz, which is basically a mix between American jazz and Latin American music. So, and that was a huge thing at that time, because there were a lot of jazz musicians traveling from or to South America or Latin America, and they tried to incorporate the sounds, the rhythmic sounds of local traditions of music into jazz. So that you have African Cuban jazz, Brazilian jazz, and it's very interesting. And particularly Afro-Cuban jazz was very influential, with people like Tito Puente and Cugat and Sandoval. And again, there is here on this slide here, there is a very famous piece which I included. It's All You Come By, and it's a typical example of Afro-Cuban jazz. Now, in the 60s, because next lecture will be about rock too. So again, by this time, rock and roll music was already performed everywhere. But we will talk about rock music separately, even though there is a continuation between blues and rock music, and I will talk about that in next video. But Brazilian jazz in the 60s is very important, particularly bossa nova. I don't know if you guys are familiar with bossa nova. Bossa nova is a type of music from Brazil, and like samba. And again, it was used by jazz musicians, especially the rhythmic aspects of bossa nova, and by composers such as Gilberto, Jobim. So there were a lot of different people, a lot of different musicians experimenting with African American music, Latin American music, Brazilian music, and South American music in general. One of them was also Stan Getz here, which is in this slide, and there is another example. Before I talk about next video about rock music, you have to know that by the early 60s, jazz music was really, really influenced by all kinds of sounds, all kinds of rhythmic ideas, all kinds of melodic ideas, and also a lot of instruments. So by the 60s, we have fusion music, which is a mix between jazz, rock, blues, rhythm and blues. And one of the main characteristics of fusion is that musicians started to include electronic instruments. So they started to create electronic effects, right? Which for us is normal today, but at that time was actually very innovative, because we're talking about the early 60s. So we're not talking about 2020. And this is very important. And a lot has to do actually with rock, because some of the rock bands like Pink Floyd, which we'll talk about later, were some of the first to use these very strange and experimental sounds with electronic instruments and incorporate those into rock, especially in the mid 60s. So fusion jazz is the combination of jazz, rock music, rhythm and blues, and even other kinds of music. So in the next video, we will talk about rock and so on. But this is very important, because the idea is, I'm going to go back for a second, is to understand that jazz fundamentally comes from classical music and African American music. So the reason why this is important, because without classical music, there wouldn't be jazz, because it's a mix between African American music and classical music. Then from from jazz and blues, you have rock music, which we'll talk about next time. So that's how we got to the point. That's how we got to the music that we listen to today, because rock, blues, rock, pop, and so on. Okay, so I will stop here, and I will see you in the next video.